First of all, just a warm welcome to all the people here today. And I'd also like to welcome all the people on the internet. And people were speaking to me on the phone. So I know that even from Germany, there are people watching on the internet also. So a big welcome to everybody who's joining us over Zoom on the net. And great to see you all here on this wet evening. It's pouring rain all day, but still it's great to see a good crowd here today. So I'll start without any further words. And we have on our first slide Lettice Baroness Offaly and the Siege of Geashill is the holding slide. And before I start, there are 3 points I would like to make before I start the actual lecture. The first one is the lecture is in 3 parts. The first part is on the background of Lettice. That is about her ancestors, the castle she lived in, the land around Geashill that she owned, the Barony of Geashill, and her family. The second part in the middle is all about the Siege of Geashill. It's a fascinating story. And the last part is about her retirement in England, the poetry that she wrote, and the literature and letters that she wrote. She was a fantastic, eloquent, and very good writer. So we're looking at that in the third part. 2 notes before I start. The first note is that nearly all of the sources for tonight's lecture for the book are from more the Lettice's version of the conflict of the story. So there is built in an inherent bias that all the documents I gathered were nearly most of them, 90%, from her side of the conflict and her side of the story. So there isn't sufficient balance, if you want to have political balance, in this evening's story lecture on getting the other side of the story. That's the Irish clans and the O'Dempseys, the O'Connors, who lived in the area previously. So it's slightly unbalanced from that point of view, but it's just the sources I have, and today's topic is on her life and her biography, just to see it in that context. It is a very divisive period. There was a lot of conflict at that time, a polarized society between maybe the newer Protestant planters and the old Gaelic clans. That is the history of that period. It is my hope that for unity, that will somehow, through learning about history, it brings everything together, and that unity is an issue to me. So I'll move on. That was the introduction. Now, looking at the very first slide of the actual talk, we have, to understand Lettice and her character, we have to look at her ancestors, who she was, where she came from. She was a member of the most powerful family in Ireland, the FitzGerald clan, the Norman FitzGeralds. And there are many famous ancestors directly in her family tree. So here is her family tree, and we have at the very bottom Lettice here from 1580 to 1685, 58. And her tree goes all the way back to the very first Norman who set foot on Irish soil. It was called Maurice the Invader. And he set foot in Ireland before Strongbow. He was an advance party who came 3 months before Strongbow. So he was the first Norman to set foot on Irish soil. And from Maurice the Invader goes all the way down. We won't go into the details. We have the great earl, that's Garrett Moore, very well known. He was her great-grandfather. Then we get our great-great-grandfather. Then we get Gerald, the wizard earl, who lived in Kildare and Geashill Castle. That was her grandfather, and she was technically his heir. And we get Silken Thomas was her grand uncle. So they're just some of the people in her family tree. This family, the heritage that it came with, gave her a great sense of entitlement. We're important. We have the right to own land. We have the right to be leaders. There was a very natural self-confidence that's in all her writings. And she claimed to be the heiress to the FitzGerald inheritance through her grandfather, because her father died young, and her father was the eldest son of her grandfather. So that's the introduction about her. Now, here's a very interesting document which I got from Sherborne Castle in England. And they said to me but I haven't got a transcript. They said this is the deed for Geashill barony from 1563, a very early land deed. So this deed represents the end of the Irish clans and the beginning of the English estates. This deed epitomises that change, that big political change. It's a very early deed, and a lot of people don't know it exists. It's in Sherborne Castle, and I got a copy of it 6 months ago. This deed is written out to Gerald FitzGerald, the wizard earl. That was Lettice's grandfather, and it was a time of just about of the plantation of Lettice and Offaly. So he's the person who is the recipient, and he was the grandfather of Lady Lettice, and it's through this deed that she later received inheritance. I think on the bottom, I checked on the internet that this is probably a seal on the deed from Elizabeth I. You can see the Queen seated on a throne with a sort of a canopy on pillars over her head in sort of a royal seal. So that deed is very interesting to have because it's very early vintage or date. Just 2 years later after that deed, we have the Cotton map, which is quite well known, and many of you are familiar with it. It's a very early map of the local area. And in it, it shows clearly the barony mentioned in the deed. In the Cotton map, we have the dotted line showing the boundary of the barony right around here. At the very top, we have landmarks. For example, we have Geashill Castle in a red circle. You can see it up on a motte, and quite a considerable castle at that time. That's the old medieval castle. We have Killy Abbey, by far the oldest site. We have Killuran marked. We have Anna Harvey here with a small tower on the Esker. We have the rivers and other things as well. Tullamore is non-existent. Tullamore is here where the forestry is. Okay, so I say that as a proud Geashill man. Now, if you zoom in, this is a trace of the original. You will see the castle is on a motte here. That's a trace to scale. You see the Esker Ridge was very prominent. There was farmland in brown, north and south, or on both sides. That's the east and west, actually. East and west of the Esker Ridge. North is to the right-hand side. We see bogland is in blue-grey, the farmland is in brown, the forestry is in green. You can see the amount of forestry still left. These old maps, just a matter of point of interest, were all written from an English perspective. If you were over in England, up on a hill in Wales, and you looked across towards Ireland, you would have the top of that map at the end of your vision. So they drew the maps as they saw it from their perspective. That's why the west is at the top and north to the right-hand side. Okay. So you can see the landscape that Lettice, that's the land she lived in. We're now going to the castle she lived in. The castle here in Geashill, you see it here up on the motte. That's a very early photo from 1869. That's 2019. The castle was first mentioned in the Book of Malahide, the first mention of a castle at Geashill, and that's in the date 1195. So it was there in 1195. That's a very early Norman castle. The Normans just came a few years previously. It was probably a timber castle at that stage. That was the beginning. It ended when Lettice vacated the castle in 1642 after the siege, after 3 sieges. There's no record of it being lived in again after that. That is the castle there. The ruins were removed for building the manor house in the early 1800s, probably about 1820, I'm not sure of the date. So the manor house was built here and removed most of the castle that was on that platform. And part of the castle was left on the motte as a folly, as the decoration. We'll go on to the next slide. Now we're going inside the castle. We have, fortunately, a wonderful document showing all the contents in great detail of that castle. And it's in the British Museum. That's the British National Library. You'll see a stamp here. And this is in a scroll. In 1628, there was a scroll written of 13 pages. And they're all stitched together. See the stitching along here? And that's a long roll. And I emailed the British Museum and I tried to get photographs of it. So there are photographs. It cost me 60 sterling per photograph. So I only got 3 and not all of it photographed. And this is photographs of the scroll of the contents of Geashill Castle written in 1628. And it goes through great detail. It goes through every room is mentioned. The bed linen coming from Holland or Spain, blown glass from merino glass in Venice and Italy is mentioned. Furniture from Holland, Turkish carpets of Turkey work, that's the Persian carpets are mentioned, wood carving, stools, tables, and every plate is mentioned whether it's chipped or not. All the kitchen equipment is mentioned with graters and ladles and 3 spits for turning roasts at the fire. All the outbuildings are mentioned. There's the buttery for making butter. There's the washing room for washing clothes. There's the bakehouse. There's the brew house. They were brewing beer. There was the tool house with 6,000 nails in it and wedges and hammers. And there were knives for cutting weeds, weeding knives for weeding the garden. So it's great to have that inventory. It's very bad writing. It's very illegible, but we have a transcript of most of it. Now, I can't go through it all. We don't have time here today, but it's a wonderful document to have from Geashill Castle in the British Museum in England. Here is a zoom in of the Great Chamber. And Rachel McKenna drew a picture of the Great Chamber as described in that scroll. It says there are a stack of pikes in the corner as a small armoury, a status symbol. Obviously, the Great Chamber was the feasting room, the place where they gathered all the VIP guests, the guests of honours. There was a large fireplace with a fire tongs, a fire shovel. It's all described. Stools, 6 stools, so and so many chairs, a long wooden table. There were wood carvings on the wall. There were yellow curtains, and were portraits of ancestors. So it gives a real view of the castle at that time in great detail. Wonderful to have. So that's the inside of Lettice's castle, just building up on it. Now, I've spoken about her castle, her lands, the barony, and I now want to speak very briefly on her personal life, just to build up a picture, the background. She was born in 1580 and she died in 1658, nearly 80 years of age. That was a huge age in those days. She married Sir Robert Digby when she was 18 years old. When you're 18 to 20, you normally got married. She had 10 children. A huge number of children to have, and I admire, we've 3 children. So I admire anybody who medieval times, late medieval times, reared. She had lots of nannies probably to help, but still she had 10 children, 7 boys, 3 girls, over 20 years. Her husband passed away when they were still relatively young, after 20 years of marriage. And she describes this time as, in her own words, 20 years happy, wedded and secure. So that's her own description of looking back at her 20 years of marriage. She was a widow for 40 years afterwards. So that's a little bit on her personal life. Now, they were a young married couple and they needed money, her and her husband. She married Robert Digby. He was an aristocratic family, landed gentry from England. So they were a young married couple. They were Geashill Castle became sort of half vacant because one of her uncles died at sea. He was drowned. It was part of the FitzGerald lands. So she assumed the role of owning Geashill Barony, and she assumed the title of Baroness Offaly before she actually received it. And then from the material resources, she litigated over the land more than the barony for over 20 years. So you can see in the family tree here, her grandfather wrote the will. And his eldest son was Lettice's father, Gerald, and he died young. So she was the only child. She was the only child of the oldest brother, the heir. So technically, she should have inherited anything. But her grandmother, Mabel Brown, in the portrait here, who lives in Geashill Castle, which is a hotel today near Geashill Castle, Dermot, she said, "No way will my granddaughter get everything, and I've 2 sons." So she said that Henry, he was her next second eldest son, was the 12th Earl. And William, her third son, was the 13th Earl. He only had 2 daughters. He drowned at sea in 1599. So still they litigated then against a distant cousin not showing on the family tree. So this legal argument went on for a long time. Her husband, Robert Digby, was a barrister. So her husband was a lawyer, and that helps to fight over the legal case for land. And a lot of the court cases at the time, they were very gossiped about. This was a big controversy. And here at Dublin Castle, that's a recent photo, that's the Tower of Castle Chambers. It was in this tower that the court case was held. It was a court at the time in 1600. So that's a tower in Dublin Castle. And the litigation went on for so long and consumed all the time the court and a lot of money that the leaders of Ireland were complaining that other more important business is not being listened to because it's legal wrangling over the inheritance of the House of Kildare. What happened eventually was that Mabel Brown had forged the will, as proved later. She didn't forge the will, but she added a sentence to it. And the sentence said, male heirs only. Only men can inherit the FitzGerald land. And it was proven that that was inserted later. And she couldn't be brought to court or accused because she was very important. So her solicitor had to fall on his sword and claim responsibility for changing the will. And he was ruined and he lost all his money. So her solicitor took the punch for it, okay? So anyway, eventually, it wasn't settled in court and it was brought to King James I. And he said, it's going on for 10 years, I'll arbitrate as sort of the King of England. So he arbitrated, give Lettice the Barony of Geashill. And so she was given the arbitration by King James I, the land of the Barony of Geashill. She was given a title that was important of Baroness Offaly. That's a very old title. It was a prestigious title. And for her life only. That prestigious old title going back 400 years was not allowed for her children. And the title for her heirs, they had to do something as well. They received Baron of Geashill. So a new title was created for her heirs and children. And we have down here the first Baron Geashill. That's again Robert, the same name as his father, Robert Digby. He was the first Baron of Geashill. We have here, for example, the second Baron of Geashill. That's his memorial plaque, his gravestone in England. And it says, grandson and heir of Lettice Baroness Offaly, Baron of Geashill, it says at the top. So it's lovely to see that the Geashill name is mentioned on gravestones in the private chapels in England, and people aren't aware of it here. And here, for example, we have the 5th Baron Geashill here. So we don't have pictures of all of them. So that line continues until today. Okay? Now, moving on. Lettice, when she received the land from King James I, King James I did many smaller plantations of settlers, English settlers. And one of them, Lettice, part of the deal that she got to Barony was that she settled some English tenants there. And this is a wonderful transcript of a letter in an archive in England. And it's not written by Lettice herself. She would write a lot more subtly. It's written by her agent to the agent of the king. So from one agent to the other agent, her agent to the king's agent. And it says, by His Majesty's award made between the Earl of Kildare, that was the person she was suing for the land, her uncle, and the petitioner, that's Lady Lettice, in 1619 she was awarded land. She was allotted the manor of Geashill, which in times of rebellion was the only den and receptacle of all the rebels in that part of the kingdom. She complains how all the rebels congregated towards Geashill into her area. And she writes this obviously to the administration in London. So there's a bit of spin in it too. And that she was given the land that she should make a plantation of English tenants there. Okay, that was part of the instruction. But the bordering neighbours, especially the better sort of the ancient Irish, the better sort are the Irish gentry, who desired not to have the English inhabit amongst them, to hinder her and her tenants, that's her English tenants, from proceeding in that good work. She calls the plantation a good work. Daily perpetrate one horrid act or another within her said manor of Geashill, to the great loss and discomfort of her honest tenants there planted. The first English tenant planted there had been robbed of all his goods, and he and one of his servants sore wounded and left for dead. The cattle of the other tenants stolen, and in a further show of their malice, they killed one of her, that's Lady Lettice's, breeding hawks sitting on her eggs. So she had a hawk hatching eggs, and local people who didn't like her that much killed the hawk. So that's only part of the letter. I'll have to move on. So that's a wonderful description of how difficult it was to get new settlers into the area and harassment. That was very typical of that time. Okay. Now, a further slight indication, I just put this in, of the plantation was that when Cromwell came in down survey maps, that's the exchange of land, Cromwell moving out Catholic Irish and moving in more English Protestant planters. I just say it technically, the way it's written in history books. The Barony of Geashill is empty, but there's changes going on all around, and that is because Lettice had already done some plantation in the area previously, 20 years previously. So that emptiness in the Barony of Geashill is an indication that there were already settlers there at that time of Cromwell. Okay. I finished the first part of my talk. We're going on to the siege. There were 3 sieges in total. The main reason, there was politics involved, but a good reason for the siege was part of the so-called 1641 rebellion. And the main cause for the rebellion was the plantation of Irish land, which caused upset, needless to say. So there was other political factors too, which we can't go into now. But the 1641 rebellion, initially, it was only Irish Catholic gentry, it was Irish leaders who hoped to have a coup, to want to overthrow the English administration in Dublin and build a Catholic Irish government. And so it was only the gentry fighting among each other. It didn't involve the broad population. And then that coup failed. And then it spilled over, the hostilities spilled over into the Irish population, the broad population, attacking and harassing English settlers. It was quite violent in Ulster. In Ulster, several thousand Protestants died. But Lettice would have been a prime target because of her history. She was a royalist as well. And because of the politics in Geashill Barony, she would have been a target. And she was targeted in that rebellion, hence the sieges. The rebellion failed ultimately, and Oliver Cromwell is a consequence of that rebellion. Because of the rebellion, he came a few years later to sort of tidy up and establish control again. So Cromwell is the follow-on from the 1641 rebellion. And now I have in here a few documents, very interesting documents. So we have the 1641 rebellion. On your right, you have the first document on the right, shows at the very top, it's a list, it's a name list of the defenders of Geashill Castle, who was inside the castle defending it. And you have In Ye Black Castle. Geashill Castle had a part of it, I think, was called the Black Castle. Okay? Essex Digby, that's Lady Lettice's second eldest son. He became a bishop later in the Anglican Church. He's the first name. Then we have Corporal Collier or whatever, and a musket. The weapon he had is always given. And I think there might be GIF. It says GIF or gift, whatever. Then there was Henry Knowles. And then most of them had a musket. You can see musket, a list of all the names. Then we have in the second red circle, we have on the walkways, in the walk to the Black Castle. On the walls, sorry. So there was a wall on Black Castle. Here we have on the north battlements. So different portions of the castle. There were people with muskets stationed during the siege in every part of the castle defending it. The list is about 40 people. The people in the castle, about 2/3 are English names, 1/3 is Irish names. So there was mixed. She had supporters locally as well, but the majority were people that she knew who might have been settlers, okay? Outside the castle, about 40 people. Outside the castle, there might have been about 300 with the O'Dempseys. We'll come to that later. Here's a small drawing of the castle wall, which initially looks not that interesting, but it probably gives, for musket shots, different elevations. You get the top elevation of the battlement on a wall. You get the ground line. That's of the causeway, the road going up to the castle. And then you get, that's the height of the causeway. And this is the height of the ground outside the wall, the bottom line. And there's a scale on the bottom. So there might have been, if you get a good shot from the causeway or different elevations over the battlements, how you can shoot in. I am not sure of the details. So that's a sketch of one of the walls of Geashill Castle during the siege. Now, we move on. Technically, there were 3 sieges. Now, the date for this siege is a little bit, there's a problem, because we presume it's October 1641. There's a cross out of 1 and 2 is written in one document. So some people think it was 1642. We don't really know. Most people say it was 1641. Because otherwise it was the first or the last siege. But we presume it's the first here tonight. It was led by Barnaby O'Dempsey. The O'Dempseys were their cousins of Lady Lettice and were her neighbours in Ballycane. They were very next door neighbours, and their grandmother was Lettice's aunt. They were quite close relatives. So they were fighting within the family and within neighbours, and you have to understand the context. Now, he made a wooden engine. That's a battering ram. It's called a wooden engine, a little bit like in the diagram. And locally, it was called a hog or a sow, because it looks like a pig with a snout banging into the wall. And it's called a hog or sow. And it was built in the churchyard. If you go into Geashill, you see St. Mary's Church, and in that churchyard, it was built. Lady Lettice, there's a well-known poem which only came to light recently called, it's a lovely Latin name, there's humour in it, Monstrum Horrendum. That up here in the very top of this the poem on an old bit of paper. This poem was written in 1641. During the siege, the poem was written, and it was written from within the battlements by somebody inside. And Monstrum Horrendum is horrendous monster, refers to the sow or the pig. There's great humour in it. And it calls it O'Dempseys up here. It says O'Dempseys alias devils. The O'Dempseys are the devils. And in that poem, it says, rise hellish monster. That's the pig. Rise hellish monster from that sacred den. The sacred den is the churchyard. That's where the prayer should be. For thy foul carcass, that carcass is the timber work, for thy foul carcass, no other pen can be found. And it goes on, and let us see, and to make thy filthy bed in the place so sacred and hallowed, so near God's temple, where his praises are sung. So whoever wrote the poem really attacks that, to use a sacred ground of the church to build a weapon of war, and diminish and demolish the O'Dempseys as being devils and their machine being a pig with a hellish body and a foul snout in a filthy pen. So it's a wonderful poem. Right, so we move on from the poem. The supplies of water were cut off. And she wrote later, if it wasn't for God in his mercy sent a great glut of rain, we would have died for want of water. She wrote to Lord Ormond, the leader of the royal forces. All the turf was, she had a shed full of turf, as people still have. And all the turf was, by the Dempseys, piled up against the entrance door and lit and burned. They tried to burn the door down with the turf, and they failed. There was an attack and there was a counter-attack. There were several people killed, or records of people being killed by musket fire. And there's a record of them, of the O'Dempseys leaving some injured people behind, and they accuse them from leaving your injured behind. It was bad and not that nice. And after 16 days, even though they were far outnumbers, the O'Dempseys withdrew, and they actually, so the sow, her body was split asunder for the fire. That's a line in this poem later down. When it left, the turf was gone, so they split up the sow and they had more firewood for the winter. And another one says that they were bad at using the battering ram. It didn't work properly. And it says about the O'Dempseys, because of their ignorance and unskillfulness in siege warfare, they failed. Now, that's quite a political comment probably as well, but the use of this battering ram wasn't that successful. So that's the first siege. Now, the second siege, both of these are often considered one siege because the leaders are brothers. So, but I divide them in two. The leaders this time were Henry and Charles O'Dempsey. They were brothers of Barnaby, older brothers. Remember, the O'Dempseys were neighbours. So they were next door neighbours in Ballycane. They were the very next territory down the land, just east of Geashill. They were cousins of Lettice. They were quite close relatives. And we have a wonderful siege letters. There were letters now sent in and out, asking her to surrender, a summons letter for asking her to surrender. And she replies in no uncertain terms. There was a musket barrage. There was a counter musket fire. And Lettice also taunts them. At one stage, it's well documented, a musket bullet hit the side of a window, and Lettice was just standing beside the window in the shadow of the window, and after it hit the window she wiped the damage done, the dust on the window frame, and she shook the handkerchief at the O'Dempseys down below and she taunted them, and that's documented. And it's quite funny, she had a great sense of humour even when her life was in danger. So she taunts them with her handkerchief and cleans her castle that was damaged. And this also failed with a counter barrage. So they retreated to Monasterevern, and the O'Dempseys captured Monasterevern Castle. So they got great spoils in Monasterevern. Geashill, they couldn't get in. So it shows relatively terms. I just want to look at two of the letters sent in. This is the summons letter. It says, Honourable. These are the O'Dempseys writing in, asking her to surrender. That's Charles and Henry. We, His Majesty's loyal subjects. They were bluffing. They were not His Majesty's loyal subjects. At the present employed in His Majesty's service for the sacking of this your castle. They twist the whole politics around as if they are the loyal subjects. And they threaten quite very little braggishly, and they really want to sabre rattle. So they say in no uncertain terms, otherwise upon the non-yielding of the castle, we do assure you that we will burn the whole town, kill all the Protestants, and spare neither man, woman, nor child upon taking of the castle by compulsion. They're strong words. Now, I think it was only sabre rattling, and it was in their language they wanted to frighten her. So, then it says humorously that the lads outside, they knew they weren't being taken that seriously. So they write, think not that we brag. Don't think we're bluffing or boasting. And then at the very end of the letter, with great humour, to write, to the honourable and thrice virtuous lady, Lady Lettice. So they treat her very courteously at the beginning and the end of the letter, and in the middle, they say they will murder everybody. So there's a bit of humour in that. And why she was 3 times virtuous, I don't know what the 3 virtues were, but she's the thrice virtuous lady, the Lady Digby, and Henry Dempsey and Charles, and they all sign. Now she replies, she's very little bit condescending. I received your letter wherein you threatened to sack this my castle by His Majesty's authority. I have ever been a loyal subject and a good neighbour among you, and therefore cannot but wonder at such an assault. I thank you for your offer of a safe convoy, wherein I hold little safety, and therefore my resolution is that being free from offending His Majesty or doing wrong, I will live and die innocently, and will do the best to defend my own. She wants to defend her castle, leaving the issue to God. And though I have been and still desirous to avoid the shedding of Christian blood, she always brings the morals out to make them feel guilty. Yet being provoked, your threats shall not wit dismay me. Your threats will not ruffle me. And she says, to my cousin Henry, he was the older one, Dempsey, and the rest. She doesn't even mention here. She says, and the rest of the band, whoever you are. She just mentions. So she's very condescending in that letter. Now, so that was a second siege. So we're on to the third siege. Now, so that's also failed. The third siege was led by Lewis O'Dempsey. And he was Viscount Clamalier. He got a surrender and regrant for a lot of the Clamalier lands. Now, at that time, the cannon was a big new weapon. So Lewis decided we need a cannon to threaten her, this new super gun. And he went into the Geashill area, and you can see there he collected 140 pots and pans from the Geashill district. This is well documented. And they brought a blacksmith from Atboy in County Meath who knew how to make cannons, had to bring the expertise in from County Meath. And that blacksmith smelted the metal 3 times. It was melted and cooled and melted and recooled 3 times to get the quality. And then they cast the cannon. And Lettice and the others in the poem, they described the cannon with a little bit of humour as the world's great wonder. They make little of it, the world's great wonder in a cynical way. And then the cannon was placed in front of the castle on a ridge, on a height, and a letter was sent in, a summons letter. And the summons letter, I can't read all the letters here, but it asks her again to surrender the castle, and she'll get a safe convoy to a garrison or to Dublin. And it says, my lord, this is her reply to the letter. I little expected such a salute from a kinsman whom I have ever respected, you being not ignorant of the great damages. That goes on, some of her cattle were robbed and stuff. And then she says lower down, however, I am still of the same mind and can think no place safer than my own house, that's her castle. Therein, if I perish by your means, that's the cannon, the guilt will light on you, you'll be the guilty one, and I doubt not, but I shall receive a crown of martyrdom, dying innocently. God, I trust, will take a poor widow into his protection from all those which without cause are risen up against me. So that's her reply. And guess what happened? They said she's staying, so the gunner went to fire up the cannon. This is just a drawing I did a while ago. So here we have Lewis and the gunners and the cannon. They load the cannon, and there are about 4 soldiers near it and the gunner. And the cannon explodes and splits asunder. A lump of it blew off, and the gunner was killed. So Lettice's prognosis that God will help her came true, and she must have thought, God is on my side. The cannon was repaired, and it blew a second time. And then they were really frustrated and had another musket barrage about 3 days later. And that was unsuccessful as well. So she was lucky, God was on her side, and a cannon exploded. And she had a great inner victory with that. It was luck as well, obviously. So we move on. So it is believed that Lewis O'Dempsey and some of the O'Dempseys were still around from the third siege when suddenly at speed a convoy of English troops came from Dangan. There were 600, quite a large army, 600 professional soldiers. There's a list of them. There were dragoneers. There were different types of musketeers. They had a lot of armour and weapons and well trained. And Lady Lettice was an avid letter writer. Her sword was her pen. She fought with her pen. And here's the Earl of Ormond. He was the leader of the Royal Irish Army, the English army in Ireland. He was the leader of the army. And she wrote to him at least 3 times looking for help in the previous few months. And she says a lot of her letters were intercepted. And they had in Dublin Castle, a meeting was held in Dublin Castle, and they said they have to send relief to Lady Lettice in Geashill. And then Sir Charles Coote was commissioned with other leaders to bring that army from Dublin Castle at speed to rescue her. And they went via Maynooth, the castle near Carbery, on to Dangan, and from Dangan they crossed by the fort at Ballindegar towards Geashill. That was the route to Geashill from Dublin always at that time. And here is the O'Dempseys immediately retreated. When the soldiers came, they had to withdraw. So Dempseys retreated, maybe a few days before, probably because the troops arrived. And the troops brought a lot of ammunition. They brought gunpowder, muskets, ammunition, everything she needed. And they brought a lot of food, or victuals as they call it. So she was besieged, she couldn't get out, they needed food. They brought food and ammunition. And this is one of her letters she wrote to the Earl of Ormond. My very good lord, besieged by the Dempseys 16 days together, as if God of his mercy had not sent a great glut of rain, we had perished for want of water. And she goes on like that. I read that letter earlier, that line. And she lower down in the letter. So in that letter near the bottom, she very much plays the poor widow to the Earl of Ormond, saying, to a poor distressed widow, you have to come and help. I don't have the exact words. So she plays the politics of a poor widow, asking the men to come to her help. Okay? So that was that. Now, eventually she has to leave in her own time. She's besieged for now nearly a year, over a year. After the third siege was in May, first week of May. During all of the summer and right into October 1642, about 7 months later, she decides we'll leave in her own time. So she retires to Coleshill. Coleshill is the home and inheritance of her husband, Robert Digby, in England. There was continuous harassment during the summer. You can see the top here. Lettice decides to retire. This is Coleshill Old Manor. It looks quite modern, but it's a very old house. It's a motted house with water around it. You can't see it here, but there's a moat-filled water trench around it, and it was destroyed in the 1800s. And Sir Richard Grenville, he was in Trim. Trim Castle was a big fort. And he marched from Trim to Dangan to rescue Lady Lettice. She couldn't walk out on her own. She needed an escort. Now, Sir Richard went from Dangan towards Geashill, and he was ambushed at Ballindegar, where the bogs are. And during that ambush, he lost a lot of gunpowder and weapons, was taken from him, and he had to scuttle and run back to Dangan Castle, which was for safety. And he was stuck there, and he couldn't make the last stage towards Geashill. So Lettice was in Geashill, wanted to get to England. Her escort, Sir Richard Grenville, was in Dangan, and then it was negotiated that Sir John Gifford, he lived near Carbery. His wife was related to Lewis O'Dempsey's, Viscount Clamalere's wife. So through family connections, they made a deal that Lettice would be allowed to Dangan, a bit of Richard Grenville's help, and move on from there. A deal was negotiated. And she, with that escort then, she went to Dublin and on to England. Geashill Castle, there's very little information. Michael asked me at the beginning, what happened to the old medieval castle afterwards? There's nearly no records. It was never lived in again. We don't really have many records. Maybe it was and I missed it. There's one record in the House of Commons, in the minutes from the House of Commons Parliament in England, that Geashill Castle was burnt at some stage after that. So I have a question mark behind it, but there is a record in the minutes from the House of Commons. Cromwell, what happened to the O'Dempseys? Cromwell executed Barnaby and Henry O'Dempsey. And they were executed by a firing squad because there was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They fired with muskets and killed English settlers, so they'd be killed in the same way by musket fire on the parade in Kilkenny City. They were executed, together with many others. Lewis O'Dempsey was a leader, pleaded he was innocent of the knowledge of killing English settlers. So he was imprisoned for nearly 10 years. And then he was rehabilitated and got a lot of his land back in 1662. 20 years after the siege, he was rehabilitated. The Digby Estate was an absentee land estate or landlord for 300 years after that. He always only had an agent. So that is just the retirement of Lettice and after the siege. Just to go to the original sources, just that you know, nearly all the letters I mentioned, nearly all of them are in the books of depositions. The books of depositions were, they went all over Ireland after the 1641 rebellion. People went all over Ireland and wrote lists, long lists of the damages done to the settlers. What injuries they received, loss of property, if they were killed or injured, and what losses they had. And in those books of depositions, similar for Lady Lettice, all the letter, the correspondence, and they're kept at Trinity College in the archive, and that's the main source for the siege of Geashill and people who've written about it. The poem Monstrum Horrendum is a wonderful new document describing in detail the cannon, the hog, the battering ram, and lots of other things. That was hidden, and in 1998 at an auction that appeared in London. It was bought by Trinity College. So it's lovely to have something on the siege of Geashill that is hidden for nearly 400 years, and suddenly a poem appears, a wonderful long poem about it after 400 years. And it was in Trinity for about 15 years and nobody looked at it. And after 15 years, Dr. Maxwell, I forget her name, she looked at it and recognised it as a siege of Geashill, and she wrote a history paper on it. So that shows how things can reappear after 400 years on something that's important to local people. Now, I finished the second part of Siege. I'm going to wrap up. I don't know where I am on time. Hopefully I'm not too long. Just about 4 minutes on her poetry and letters, because it's a big part of her personality and who she is. She wrote many letters. I found about 4 or 5 letters. I didn't do an exhaustive search of letters of hers in archives in England. Trinity College has 2 or 3 maybe of her letters. And you see on the right-hand side typically what letters in those days looked like. It was on a sheet of paper. You wrote in the top right corner. This was to a lord in Wexford or Waterford. And she tells him, "Strike while the iron is hot." So she was always into political things and encouraging others. I think it's about land. And Lettice Offaly, her signature here. Here's the seal. Her seal has a cross, which comes from the FitzGerald emblem, the coat of arms of the FitzGeralds. And it was folded down the middle, folded a second time, and was folded the third time. So the actual letter is only the tiny little thing here. There was no envelope. And then the bit of paper, the wax, you can see where the wax was torn out, the notch gone out of the left-hand side. It's under the wax when it was opened. So you can see the address here, who it's for. So that's typical of her letters. It's interesting to see how the letters were. They're very small little things. And they were given to a messenger, and many letters were lost when the messengers got killed or something happened. And she always complains about that. So that's typical of her letters. Her poetry is quite good, and she's now at the end of her life. So this poem here, which Lady Lettice wrote, is a wonderful, she's blind. Old people in those days, couldn't do the eye surgery because of blindness. They always became blind as it went towards 80. And she's blind, she's very immobile and old, but very active, sharp mind. And she writes a poem contemplating her death and that God will receive her. She wants to die. She's asking God, please take me. And she writes, "Mine eyes turned inward, I do plainly see what enemies, vain outward objects be." Initially, she litigated for land, and now she said, vain outward objects, material things, are totally unimportant when you're old. "To my repose, and since my eyes are blind, sweet contemplations elevate my mind. To higher thoughts, for now by fate I see my Saviour," that's God, "on his throne of majesty, bent to receive my soul when she is fled," that's fled from this life, "from all those foes that have her captive led. Death keeps the key of this dark prison. So she wants to die, and she feels if she dies, the prison door will be opened and she'll be released again. So death keeps the key of this dark prison, where she lies enthralled with sin and bound with care. O send thy summons, Lord, and set her free, that she may live eternally with thee. Let my body quietly descend into my grave, and there with peace attend the coming of my Lord and Saviour sweet, when soul and body, that's the resurrection, both with him shall meet. Happy retirement that doth make me more acquainted with myself than hithertofore. She's getting to know herself better in old age. I thought that youth and beauty still would last, but both, like faded flowers, soon are past. And when she was young, she was quite proud. Honour puffed up with pride is but a bubble, blown by ambition and laid flat with trouble. Honour in these our latter times and ages, contempt and envy follows her as pages. Whilst makes her wings and soon doth fly away, which our old age doth make her chiefest stay, and thus deceived, whilst we do covet more, we find ourselves much poorer than before. And whilst we covet what we cannot get, our glass runs out and our sun is set. So that's a wonderful poem, and at the end she sort of says all her litigation over land and everything and power, at the end we covet more and it's only a bubble and we're puffed up with pride. So it's an act of maybe self-contemplation and contrition. And now we have our last slide, or maybe it's second last, I'm not sure. This is in Coleshill in England. There's a wonderful church, and that's a grade A listed Norman origin church with a tower. The steeple was built on later. That's a wonderful grade A listed building in near Birmingham, Coleshill. And that is the village church, the village town chapel. And built onto it, where the large windows are, is a private chapel for the Digbys with a crypt where they're buried. Okay, and here on the right we have the inside of that private Digby chapel. And that's where a lot of the Barons of Geashill, the landlords of Geashill, are buried, the early ones. Wonderful stained glass in it. And there used to be a plaque there. It was renovated in about 1910 or 12, and they moved the plaque, and I was on to them on the phone. They can't find it. But there used to be a plaque, was well recorded in other books. And it was a memorial to Lady Lettice. She must be in the crypt somewhere, we're not sure. But it's a memorial plaque, and she penned it herself. This is her writing. She wrote on this stone plaque, very simply, Lettice lived 18 years, a virgin pure. 20 years wedded, happy and secure. Then death deprived her of her dearest friend, that's Robert, her husband, whose constant widow she lived to her end. She was always dressed in black. She never remarried. That's why her portrait has the black, all that black clothes, very humble clothes for a lady of her class. So she always remained a widow, faithful to his memories. She died on the 1st of December, 1658. Now, I've last slide. She was a very complex character. And in this here, in her portrait you saw at the beginning, on the right-hand side of the portrait is a book with a magnifying glass. You see this beside her hand. And in the book is a quotation. And this quotation, some people thought it had something to do with the... it actually comes from the book. It's a prayer book of that time. And it reads as follows. It's from Job chapter XIX. What's that? 19. Okay, thank you. Job chapter 19, verse 16, something like that. And it says, and though after my death worms destroy this body. She knew that if you're buried, the worms come and we decompose. Remember, man, if you're dust, into dust you will return. Yet in my flesh I shall see God. And that means I believe that this body, the body's her portrait. Remember, this is a picture of her body. She's writing, I believe that this body in the portrait, where you can read the script, will rise from the dead. And she's effectively stating her belief in her immortality, that she'll still be around. And that in my flesh I shall see God, not as a spirit, but in her body. And that she believes in that. And that's a powerful act of belief. And it's a bit of a pun to the picture of her body beside it. There's an interplay. And maybe it's true, because I have as a question mark my last word, she's still among us today. So maybe she is immortal in the storytelling sense of way. Okay, so I'll finish with that. And this is not really a slide, it's only a comment. Before the question and answer, I'd love to have a great chat and vigorous questions. Ask me any tricky question. Hopefully I can answer it truthfully as best I can. We're raising funds for the National School in Geashill with the sale of the book I wrote. So all the book obviously is non-profit, and we raised €2,500 already. You can leave any donation you want. There's no price on the book. I'll leave it to yourself. There's a tin there and there are books there. Please do buy a book. Most of what is said came from that book. I got new material which is in my talk, and I didn't have it sadly when I wrote the book. And I want to raise a word of thanks to Carolina, my better half, as I always say, here in the audience, for her support. Very much for the Digby archives. I was very much in touch with, it was a while ago now, with Maria Digby, who's the archivist now at the moment. And they're great digging up more documents and more information which they have in their archives in Sherburn Castle. So many thanks to the Digby archive and all who helped with the book.